The sky has always been a stage for stories of triumph and tragedy, and I'm Jhon, welcoming you to P-Lien Recicid, where we uncover the history behind aviation's most unforgettable moments. Today, we turn not to a disaster in the clouds, but to the final curtain call of an icon that defined generations. The British Airways Boeing 747. Known as the Queen of the Skies, this legendary aircraft carried millions across oceans and continents, shaping the golden age of travel. But on its last flight, emotions soared higher than altitude itself as an era ended with one final journey. Under the vast canvas of the sky, there are moments that transcend mere aviation and become chapters of human history. Moments when an aircraft is not just a machine of steel and rivets, but a living, breathing symbol of connection, progress, and dreams. The final flight of the British Airways Boeing 747 was one such moment, not marked by tragedy or disaster, but by a farewell so poignant that it etched itself into the memories of everyone who witnessed it. The Queen of the Skies had carried millions over decades, crossing oceans with grace, connecting families, transporting dignitaries, and embodying the luxury of long-haul travel in ways that few other aircraft ever could. When the world learned that British Airways was retiring its fleet of 747s, the news was not simply about an airline phasing out an aircraft. It was about the closing of a cultural era, the silencing of an icon that had shaped both personal stories and collective memory. On that final journey, the engines roared not with the promise of adventure, but with the weight of goodbye, echoing across the runway like the last notes of a beloved song. Passengers and crew who had the honor of stepping aboard were acutely aware that they were not merely flying from one point to another, but participating in history, a living narrative that would be retold long after the wheels touched down. The atmosphere surrounding that farewell was unlike any ordinary departure. At airports where the aircraft prepared for its final positioning flight, crowds gathered not only of aviation enthusiasts, but of ordinary people. Families with children, retirees who had once flown on her, and dreamers who simply wanted to glimpse Her Majesty one last time. Cameras clicked, live streams buzzed across social media, and words like icon, legend, and of an era were whispered with reverence. The 747 had been a constant in the skies since the 1970s, wearing the British Airways livery like a crown, and its silhouette, recognizable with that distinctive hump, was a beacon of aviation's golden age. As the day of the last flight approached, it felt almost like preparing for a farewell ceremony, not of metal and machinery, but of an old friend who had traveled the world and was now taking a final bow. Inside the cockpit, the pilots were not just professionals on duty, they were custodians of history. For them, this was more than a checklist, more than a takeoff roll. It was a privilege mixed with melancholy. Many of them had spent much of their careers mastering the 747, flying her across continents, trusting her resilience through storms and long nights over the Atlantic. On this day, as they ran through the pre-flight rituals, their voices carried a subtle weight, knowing they were about to guide her through her last dance in the skies. The flight deck, usually a place of routine, now pulsed with emotion, with glances and nods that silently acknowledged the honor bestowed upon them. As boarding began, those who were allowed to step onto the aircraft felt a different energy. The familiar wide cabin, with its upper deck and expansive seating, seemed to carry the whispers of decades of travelers who had laughed, cried, dreamed, and rested in those seats. For the crew, many of whom had worked countless long-haul flights on the 747, this was not just another day of service, it was the closing of a chapter in their careers. Some wore small badges and mementos, others carried quiet smiles tinged with tears. Passengers took photos of every detail: the curve of the windows, the angle of the wings, the elegant lines of the cabin, trying to preserve every second before it slipped away. When the engines came to life, there was a hush outside the airport fences where spotters and fans had gathered. The deep, thunderous growl of the Rolls-Royce engines carried a resonance that spoke to decades of journeys, a sound that had once been so common at airports worldwide, now taking on the significance of a farewell note. As the aircraft taxied to the runway, the scene turned almost ceremonial. Fire trucks lined up to offer the traditional water salute, streams arching gracefully over the aircraft, as if to bless her final journey. The sight of water glistening against the fuselage in the sunlight brought tears to many eyes. It was as though the entire airport community had united to honor a monarch. The takeoff roll itself was majestic. The 747, though decades old, leapt forward with the dignity of an elder statesman making one last address. As her nose lifted and the landing gear folded away, applause erupted from the crowd, cheers and tears mixing as thousands of phones tracked her ascent. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The great aircraft rose above the runway, carving her final arc into the sky, and those watching knew they were witnessing something that would never happen again under the British Airways colours. In the air, the flight was smooth, almost serene. The crew made announcements not just of altitude and speed, but of gratitude and remembrance. They spoke of the countless journeys made possible by this aircraft. The families reunited, the business deals struck, the dreams of young travelers fulfilled. For many on board, the view outside the window felt different. Clouds seemed softer, the horizon wider, because it was all being seen through the lens of goodbye. Conversations in the cabin turned to personal stories. The first time someone flew on a 747 as a child, the thrill of climbing the spiral staircase to the upper deck, the wonder of flying non-stop across oceans. This was not just an aircraft, it was a vessel of memories, a capsule of human experience soaring one last time. On the ground, as the aircraft drew closer to its destination, thousands tracked its progress online. Flight tracking websites showed the 747's path, watched by aviation lovers from every corner of the world. Hashtags trended, videos streamed live, and messages poured in. Some from pilots of other airlines, some from ordinary travelers who had once sat in her cabins, and many from people who had never flown but had always admired her silhouette in the sky. The farewell transcended borders, proving that the 747 was not merely a British Airways aircraft but a global icon. The landing, too, was more than a technical maneuver. As the runway stretched ahead, the pilots guided the Queen of the Skies down with reverence, touching the wheels to the earth in a gentle embrace. Reverse thrust roared, then slowed, and with it came the realization for everyone watching: this was the last time a British Airways 747 would ever complete such a journey. The sight of the aircraft rolling gracefully to its final stop brought applause, but also silence, as if no words could capture the magnitude of what had just ended. After shutdown, when the engines finally wound down and fell silent, a wave of emotion rippled through all who were there. Those four mighty engines, once the heartbeat of long-haul travel, would never roar again under British Airways. The cabin lights glowed softly as passengers disembarked, many pausing to touch the walls or photograph the door, small gestures to hold on to history. Ground crews stood at attention, some saluting, others wiping away tears, recognizing that their daily companion on the tarmac had completed her final duty. In the days and weeks that followed, the images of that final flight spread across the world. Newspapers called it the end of an era. Aviation journals published retrospectives on the 747's extraordinary career with British Airways, from its first introduction in the early 1970s to its retirement accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Commentators spoke of how the aircraft had symbolized the democratization of long-haul travel, how it had made the world feel smaller and more connected. For those who had flown on it, it was deeply personal, a part of their own life story. For those who had only admired it from afar, it was still an emblem of human ingenuity and ambition. What made the farewell so emotional was that it was not just about a plane being retired. It was about the passage of time, about endings and new beginnings. The 747 had been a bridge across generations. Parents had flown on it and later brought their children aboard. Pilots had trained on it and passed down their knowledge to younger aviators. Cabin crew had grown their careers within its aisles. Its departure marked a shift, a reminder that even the mightiest symbols must one day give way to the future. Yet, as the aircraft came to rest at its final home, its story did not end. Some 747s found new lives as static displays, museums preserving them so that future generations could step inside and feel what it was like to walk the aisles of the Queen. Others were dismantled, their parts scattered but their legacy intact. In every photograph, every model airplane, every memory shared, the spirit of that final flight lives on. It was not a tragedy, not a disaster, but it was a loss felt as deeply as any. And perhaps that is why the last flight of the British Airways 747 remains so powerful. Because it was a goodbye that united people in admiration, nostalgia, and gratitude for what had been. When we look back at the history of aviation, there are aircraft that come and go with little fanfare, serving their purpose and fading quietly into retirement. And then there are legends that change the very way humanity thinks about flight. The Boeing 747 belongs to the latter category, and within the history of British Airways, it was far more than just an aircraft. It was the very symbol of international travel, the flagship that carried the airline's colors across the globe for nearly half a century. To understand its legacy is to understand not just the technical brilliance of the plane itself, but the cultural, economic, and emotional footprint it left on millions of lives. When the first 747 entered British Airways service in the early 1970s, the world was in the midst of change. Air travel had long been the preserve of the wealthy, with long-haul journeys considered an extravagance reserved for business leaders, dignitaries, and the elite. The Queen of the Skies, as she was affectionately called, changed that forever. With her enormous capacity, her unprecedented range, and her iconic double-deck design, the 747 allowed more people than ever before to cross oceans, to see distant lands, to embrace the concept of a truly connected world. British Airways seized upon this opportunity, making the 747 its workhorse, its proud ambassador, and its promise to travelers that the world was within reach. From the beginning, the 747 carried an aura of majesty. Her distinctive hump made her instantly recognizable in any lineup of aircraft, and when British Airways painted her in the classic lander livery of dark blue and grey with a regal crest, she seemed to embody both tradition and modernity. For many travelers, their first sight of a BA 747 at Heathrow was the start of an adventure. Families heading to America, holidaymakers bound for the Caribbean, students embarking on studies abroad, business people chasing opportunities in Asia. All of them stepped through the doors of this aircraft and into a story that would mark their lives. The upper deck, initially a luxurious lounge and later a premium cabin, gave passengers the feeling of being in a private jet within a giant airliner. The cavernous main deck, with its rows upon rows of seats, gave thousands their first experience of intercontinental travel. In every corner of that cabin, countless memories were made. For the crews who operated the 747, it was both a challenge and a privilege. Pilots spoke of the aircraft with reverence, marveling at the way it handled with grace despite its massive size. Flying the Queen of the Skies was not simply a job, it was an honor that carried with it the weight of decades of tradition. Cabin crew found in it a second home, one where they worked, laughed, supported one another, and cared for passengers on journeys that often stretched over 12 hours. For many, their entire careers were shaped within those aisles, and the retirement of the aircraft decades later felt like the closing of a personal chapter, as much as a professional one. The 747 was central to British Airways' image during the golden age of flight. In the 1980s and 1990s, when international tourism surged and globalization began to reshape the world, British Airways stood as a leader, proudly declaring itself the world's favorite airline. That slogan was not an exaggeration, for the sheer scale of the BA 747 network meant it reached cities across every continent. It became the face of Britain abroad, touching down in New York, Sydney, Tokyo, Johannesburg, and countless other destinations, carrying with it not just passengers, but the identity of a nation. When dignitaries traveled, when teams of athletes flew to represent their countries, when major events drew crowds from across the globe, the 747 was there, steadfast and regal, delivering people safely and reliably across oceans and continents. Its role was not only in leisure and business, but also in moments of history. The 747s carried refugees to safety, brought aid workers to disaster zones, and in times of crisis became lifelines connecting people across borders. In quieter moments, they were the aircraft of honeymoons, reunions, and family trips that spanned generations. Children who once pressed their faces against the cabin window to watch the wings cut through clouds grew into adults who later brought their own children aboard. This continuity made the aircraft not just a machine, but a vessel of memory, a bridge across eras of human experience. The 747 also carried technological significance. At the time of its introduction, it was the largest commercial aircraft in the world, a marvel of engineering that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. British Airways' decision to embrace the aircraft showed its ambition to lead in a rapidly expanding aviation market. Over the decades, the airline would operate multiple variants, upgrading cabins and services to keep pace with changing demands, but always the 747 remained the heart of the long-haul fleet. The introduction of newer, more fuel-efficient aircraft in the 2000s could not immediately dislodge its reign because it was so deeply woven into the airline's DNA and the public's imagination. But time, as always, brings change. By the late 2010s, with the arrival of aircraft like the Boeing 787 Dreamliner and the Airbus A350, the 747 began to show its age. Its four engines, once a symbol of power and reliability, became costly to operate in an era where airlines sought efficiency and reduced emissions. The cabins, though updated, carried the echoes of a design from another era. Still, there was no rush to let her go. She remained beloved by crews and passengers alike, a familiar sight at Heathrow, where her presence seemed eternal. Then came the shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. Virtually overnight, international travel ground to a halt, fleets were grounded, and airlines faced unprecedented financial challenges. For British Airways, the pandemic accelerated a decision that had long been on the horizon: the retirement of the 747 fleet. The announcement in 2020 was met with disbelief and sadness. To many, it felt unthinkable that the Queen of the Skies would vanish so suddenly from British Airways service. There would be no grand farewell tour, no prolonged transition, only the abrupt reality of an end hastened by global crisis. Crews wept at the thought of losing their second home. Passengers shared their stories online, and aviation enthusiasts flocked to airports to glimpse the final departures. One by one, the great aircraft were flown to storage facilities or dismantled, their majestic shapes leaving behind empty gates and a silence that felt unnatural. The final flights became events in themselves, with people gathering to watch the takeoffs, waving and cheering, even as their hearts ached. Yet, in their departure, the legacy of the BA 747 only grew stronger. Documentaries were made, books and articles were written, and countless photographs and videos circulated, celebrating not the sadness of loss, but the glory of what had been. Former passengers recounted stories of life, changing journeys, Pilots spoke of the honor of flying her, and cabin crew described the camaraderie built in her aisles. The aircraft became more than history. It became legend, a mythic figure in the collective imagination of aviation. To walk today into a museum or an airfield where a preserved BA 747 rests is to step into that history. Visitors marvel at the scale, climb the spiral staircase, sit in the cockpit, and imagine what it must have been like to guide such a giant across oceans. For children seeing it for the first time, it is awe-inspiring. For adults who once traveled aboard, it is deeply nostalgic. This is the enduring power of the 747 in British Airways service. It transcends the boundaries of time and continues to inspire long after its retirement. The legacy of the aircraft also lies in what it represented philosophically. It stood for ambition, for the belief that the world was within reach, that travel could connect cultures and economies in ways previously unimaginable. It was a democratizer, making faraway lands accessible not just to the elite, but to millions of ordinary people. It carried stories of love, loss, discovery, and triumph. Its presence at airports worldwide symbolized both British Airways and the spirit of flight itself. As aviation moves forward with new technologies, quieter engines, and greater efficiency, the memory of the BA 747 endures not as a relic, but as a foundation. Every Dreamliner and A350 that now crosses the skies does so on the path carved by the Queen. The pilots who fly modern fleets carry with them the lessons and traditions learned from their predecessors who once commanded the 747. Passengers stepping into sleek new cabins still feel echoes of the excitement once stirred by boarding the mighty double-decker. In this way, the aircraft lives on, not in the air, but in the culture of aviation, in the DNA of British Airways, and in the hearts of all who ever encountered it. And so, the story of the British Airways 747 ends not with tragedy, but with dignity, not with silence, but with resonance. It is a story of innovation and elegance, of journeys taken and memories made, of a world brought closer together by 4 engines and a graceful silhouette. Its last flight was a farewell, yes, but also a celebration, a recognition that this was more than an aircraft. It was a global companion, a queen who reigned in the skies for nearly 50 years. As the engines have gone quiet, the legacy roars on, carried by the countless voices of those who flew with her, those who worked with her, and those who loved her from the ground. The Queen of the Skies may no longer lift from Heathrow's runways, but in the history of British Airways and in the hearts of aviation lovers everywhere, she will never truly land.